Good evening and welcome to the May 13th, 2020 Budget Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us in this new and remote viewing format that we're using in response to Governor Brown's stay-at-home Save Lives order. This format enables the Budget Committee to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and public safe. There are a few housekeeping announcements and instructions related to the meeting format that I need to take care of first. Thank you for your patience while I work my way through them. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcasts and meeting materials webpage. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. Finally, I want to thank everyone for the patience and flexibility and good humor as we work through any kinks in this format, that this is all new to most of us. With that, I will move to recognizing the city manager to present the budget.
All right, I guess we're just going to jump right in. And Vicky's going to share the screen and she's going to kind of run the slides, so I'll have to tell her to move them forward. Perfect. So welcome. It's really good to see everybody. Good to see your faces, even if it's on a Zoom call. I could not have predicted that we would be here when we saw you in February, and we kind of off the cuff, I think Councilor Zelenka asked Chief Heppel to give his knowledge of what might be happening with coronavirus. And since that time, you know, things have been a lot focused on that. Next slide. So this isn't exactly where I was hoping we would be. I was actually thinking, when I was imagining what the FY21 budget was going to be like, I was imagining it as a place of new beginnings, not so much about my being in this role or my being new, but it was a little bit like we've been working really hard through the recession to climb our way out, and we can finally kind of see where we're going and pick some paths and directions. And, you know, it just felt like a new beginning, kind of like the riverfront is starting to sprout up a new neighborhood on the side of the Willamette. Next slide. So now I think we all know we're on a journey together. For tonight, our journey is going to be just a little bit of a glimpse of where we're at today with the COVID response. Talk very briefly about the FY21 original proposed budget. Twyla will give you a financial condition update. And then I'm going to talk about the amendments. As I said, and if you read the letter, we'll also have an opportunity to have Chief Skinner and Denny and Renee each speak to a slide, because I think they can provide more detail, and this format just allows for that. And we'll talk about urban renewal if I didn't say that already. I'm starting to think about where we're at right now, and as we think about the proposed amendments as base camp. And I was thinking about that because when you get to base camp, you've worked really hard to get there. And I think about all of the work that we've done over the years to learn how to respond to emergencies like this. But when you get to base camp, you have all the resources you need, and you're kind of checking and watching conditions, but you know you have a journey ahead. And it's hard work to get there, and you know you have more coming. But that's kind of how I'm starting to think about it. Next slide. So what's changed since we last saw you? We met on February 29th, and I think it was a few weeks later that we opened our Emergency Operations Center. And I think today marks day 62 of that center being open. It started off kind of small, and then it expanded pretty rapidly to having 2 different shifts of people working 10-hour days, 7 days a week. So it's been a lot of work and a lot of great work that's happened there. As you know, the governor issued our Stay Home, Save Lives order on March 23rd. And while we've applied, Lane County's applied to be a part of phase 1, we don't actually know if we've been accepted yet. No, everyone's really anxious to be reopened. You know, problem number 1 has always been a public health crisis, but as you know, what's really going to be, I think, as big or bigger emergency is going to be the impacts to this community over time based on the impacts to businesses. So I have a chart in here that I'm just, participant list is open. I thought this was really telling, because this chart says more than I can possibly say about what's happening, in that it's number of unemployment claims filed in Oregon. And so if you just take our proportion of that, If you look at that gray bar on the left of 2008, that 2008 to 2010. That was the height of the Great Recession and the number of claims we had. And as you can see on the right-hand side, this is where we are today. So pretty staggering loss of jobs and intense kind of situation we're in. Next slide. So I'm going to just talk about a little bit about how we've been working as an organization through that. As you know, we've had some new services that we stepped up. So we opened up the designated temporary shelter sites, and we started working with our mobile outreach teams. Both of these were in response to how we keep people sheltered in place that are that don't have homes to go to. And so as most of you, I think, know, Lane County took the lead on how they would shelter the most vulnerable of those individuals at the Lane County Fairgrounds, working with Occupy Medical at the Wheeler Pavilion as well. And we really played a role in trying to keep those that were less vulnerable but still unsheltered in place to stop the movement of the virus. It gave us a really great opportunity to test the mobile outreach, which is part of some of the tax strategies. It allowed us to explore partnerships with additional community nonprofits to support those sites. And we know that a challenge ahead will be how we continue to support those community members. This will both be a financial and a logistical challenge as we move into demobilization. So those are some of just a few new services. We've also had our ongoing essential services. I know Vicky's going to switch it. I'm just going to keep talking and she'll figure it out. I think there was, staff from every single one of our departments has continued to report to duty. They're responding to calls for service, providing essential services on site. I can just start with a few. Our custodians, our police officers, paramedics, firefighters. We have call takers. We just have building inspectors, recreation staff providing daycare services. I mean, literally, we still have people showing up, although they're being really careful. They're keeping their social distancing. They are definitely still working. I have a lot of gratitude and pride for them, and also for the staff in the EOC, which includes, some of our planners, our library staff, our park staff. It's not all the people that you would necessarily expect to be in that situation. We're also delivering we're delivering services in new creative ways, which has been really exciting. We have staff also, we have about 700 employees that are working from home. So these slides are just a little bit mixed up, so it's okay. I'm mixed up. That are working from home and still doing plan review, taking calls, and being really creative about how they adapt to these new conditions, and that happened really rapidly. And then I will give a loud shout out to some of our internal first responders, which is our our ISD division, who pretty much turned us into virtual everything in a matter of a week. So you can go back to that slide, Vicki. I would say I think within a week, they had launched Microsoft Teams and our entire city converted over to a virtual platform in record speed and time. And I've been so grateful to them. On the left, you can see our Emergency Operations Center. We have a few people meeting on site, but everybody else is logged in on the right and below on Microsoft Teams. And of course, you know that we're now conducting city council meetings and now a budget committee meeting by Zoom. So lots of new technologies and lots of fast adaptations. Next slide. So the budget is not an isolated process. And I've been talking to a couple of people about this, maybe all of the city councilors over time, about how it really needs to nest into a bigger rhythm than just the budget process. So ideally, in my world, we would be looking at kind of our now and later trends. You know, what's the data and truth about our community? We'd be getting community input. We haven't done that in a long time. It's been years since we've done a community survey. We're planning on doing one this year. That community survey and those data and trends would lead into a city council goal session or focus areas. And that work would really drive the organization's focus, which then kind of feeds into the budget process. And if you want to go to the next slide, you know, all of that is really what a lot of people would just call strategic planning. So just to make it simple vocabulary, that's how I would think of it. And you can start anywhere in the cycle. It's not like it starts or ends with the budget process. It's all just a kind of a continuous loop of how we are gauging how we're doing in the community and adapting to your work too. As you know from the proposed pre-COVID budget, I had put a one-time dollars of 75,000 in to help with that and to have somebody help facilitate that. We've actually taken that out, and I can say more about that in the amended budget. We'll find another way to do that, but that's one of the items that I felt like we could find a different way to do. But this is kind of how we end up planning it, doing it, adjusting it, and this is where I hope we'll be by this time next year. Next slide. One of the reasons why I think that's really important, as you know from the budget, like this sort of graphically represents what's kind of existing. We have a lot of dollars that are invested in personnel, in programs, and existing services that we know people really love. We have about that large amount of materials and supplies, and what we actually get every year in terms of new revenues, especially in the general fund, is pretty small around the margins. And so what we know is that if you want to make a bigger impact in some areas that we're not currently working, we probably need to do some planning around how we will align those resources to make that impact. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the second part of the presentation in relation to the TAC report and some of our support around the unsheltered. You can move it to the next slide. So that said, our FY21 pre-COVID proposed budget included a mix of creative approaches to try to get those community priorities done. So, for example, I'm going to go through a couple of these numbers. Community safety, we had planned a $9 million bridge fund to get us through to January, when we would start being able to repay that with the payroll tax. We felt really good about that. We were going to be ramping up to a little over 40 FTE, and people were just like, kind of like, everywhere I went, when is that going to happen? And it couldn't happen fast enough. We also were continuing to invest in downtown. As we know, that's been continued to be an area of importance, and an area that we've made some progress over the last couple of years. We had a $343,000 investment in climate, which was more around the planning and staffing to get us to the implementation. We also have and continue to have over $3.5 million in other investments that actually start implementing the climate ordinance and moving us off of natural gas and moving us more electric. Both with this one and downtown, we were starting to shift things to ongoing. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then also infrastructure. We have a lot of investments in the FY21 budget that was around improving, the airport, our roads, parks, wastewater facilities, stormwater facilities, and the staffing to get us there. All of those sort of align around our priorities. You can go to the next slide. One of the things that I was hoping we could do in this budget was, as we were starting to prepare it, I thought, we kind of got a little bit away from our don't use one-time dollars for ongoing expenses. And there's times when that works really well. So for example, with the community safety initiative, I think it works really well to have a one-time borrow when you have kind of a known revenue source at the other end of it. It also works really well in some of the things that were, for example, in the FY20 budget that were one-time dollars, like equity and contracting, where we can take those dollars, we can start to pilot something, understand how it works, and then work to integrate that into all of our everyday services. And so that money helps us do that. It doesn't work as well with things like funding downtown or climate. Those are longer term items, and they're gonna continue to need those funds. So what we were hoping to do was kind of start a strategy that would kind of follow this graph over several years. Like, let's take the things we're investing in one time and shift them to ongoing. So this year we were going to start to move some of our one-time FTE that are in working on climate into ongoing. We were going to take some of our one-time FTE on downtown and move it into ongoing, and try to sort of incrementally do that over the years. That was pre-COVID. You'll see some of those things taken out with the amendments. You probably already saw that, but I think it's still a really worthwhile strategy, and I think it's important to keep trying to stick with the using one-time dollars for one-time things. Next bullet. And and I'm just gonna skip that one because Chief Skinner's gonna talk a lot about that a little bit later. And then the FY21 proposed budget also included the PERS investment. You pull that one up. We talked about this in February, and Twyla's going to talk about it a little bit more in her part of the presentation. But to me, this really represented an opportunity for us to provide some stability and make some savings over the long term. So as you know from that meeting, the state investment fund is allowing us to get a 25% match. So if we made the full $8 million investment, we'd get a $2 million match, and we could use those $10 million to pay down our rates over the next 10 years, which saves us $13 million. So I know it's a little bit of a challenging math thing in the head, but that basically nets out to a $5 million savings, and we really need that to keep our end of fund balance percent at the right number. So, and I think with that, I'm going to let Twyla jump into our financial forecast, and then I'll come back with some of our amendments.
Great. Thank you, City Manager. So good evening. I'm Twyla Miller, the city's finance director, and tonight I will provide an update on the city's financial condition. In late February at your Budget Committee workshop, Maurizio Baudolico provided a preliminary overview of the general fund forecast, and I shared information about PERS and the Employer Incentive Fund. Tonight, I'll provide you a forecast update that incorporates the impact of changes to assumptions on the general fund forecast, given what we know of our current economic situation. The world has changed since we met last February, and we are living in a time of great uncertainty. Future impacts to our financial condition and the services needed by our community will be dependent upon the events that unfold over the coming months as we phase into a new normal and also understand the longer-term community and economic impacts as we look to the future. Fortunately, the city has a long history of strong fiscal stewardship and service delivery to our community. Over time, we've developed a stable service system, maintained strong reserve levels, and have remained flexible to respond to the needs of the community and the constantly changing environment. This positions us well to face the challenges ahead. This afternoon, you received a packet that contains the city manager's amendments to the FY21 proposed budget. The packet contains an amended general fund forecast that incorporates COVID impacts to our financial condition and amended budget actions to respond to this changing financial situation. These amendments incorporate a series of actions that keep key strategies moving forward and changes previously proposed service increases and funding strategies. The information amends the FY21 proposed budget and should be used in tandem with the proposed budget document you received at the end of April. At the top of each section of your new packet, there is a reference to the proposed budget document page so that you can easily see the impact of the amended proposal. Budget staff will update the final adopted budget document to change the narrative, the charts, and the unfunded needs assessment to align with the fiscal year 21 budget that is adopted by the City Council. Next slide, please. So let's get started by talking about the general fund and some of our other funds. Tonight, I will be referring to the general fund as we discuss the financial condition of the city. While there are 34 reporting funds that fit into the categories shown here, the fund types shown in the blue boxes represent funds used to account for revenue sources that are legally restricted for specific purposes or to account for operations funded by users of the service through fees and charges. The general fund is used to account for all other financial resources not required to be accounted for in one of these other funds. After walking through impacts to the general fund tonight, I will be discussing the impact to a subset of special revenue and enterprise funds that staff are monitoring as revenues to these funds have been impacted by the pandemic. Next slide. Thank you. So this is the general fund proposed budget with amendments. As a reminder, when I'm discussing the general fund this evening, I'm referring to the main subfund, which represents the true discretionary funds for the city. The amendments to the FY21 proposed budget reduced the budget by $6.4 million or 3% from the FY21 proposed budget we released in late April. The city manager will discuss specific budget actions a bit later this evening. The net budget in the general fund, after removing interfund transfers of $7.6 million, is $198.2 million. Next slide. The general fund forecast is a tool that projects how much the city will spend and receive over the next 6 years, which assists policymakers with developing strategies to meet future challenges. Finance staff regularly monitors and tracks a number of variables for the forecast and general fund management purposes, which are shown at a high level here. While we always say that the forecast ties to a set of assumptions at a point in time, I want to emphasize that point now more than ever. We are currently in an uncertain and dynamic environment, and a forecast prepared today would already be different in some aspects than a forecast prepared a month ago. I say this to state that as we know more and gain experience, the numbers will be different than they are today. With the additional economic uncertainty that is present in the current environment, as well as a wide range of possible outcomes, staff have been looking at a wide range of data to incorporate into the forecast. We are looking at our current experience with revenue collections in this new environment, looking at the economic impact of the Great Recession on forecast drivers, following economic information both regionally and at the national level, and connecting with key partners such as the Tax Assessor's Office, EWEB, other jurisdictions, and PERS. We have taken all of this information and have developed an amended general fund forecast that incorporates impacts to key variables. There is still much that we do not know. Staff will continue to monitor all of these variables to understand the impact on our financial condition over time. Next slide, please. While we aren't impacted in the now in the same way that jurisdictions that rely on sales tax for general operations are impacted, there has been an immediate impact to city revenues as a result of the pandemic. Additionally, due to the cyclical nature of an economic downturn, there will be continued impacts in a variety of areas over the next few years as we stabilize and recover. The revenue areas you see here are those we expect to be most impacted by current events in the general fund. Property taxes. While I'll go into more detail on assessed value and collection rate shortly, other impacts may be related to impacted related to the distribution and cash flow, as some taxpayers may pay in trimesters instead of making one payment in November as they typically do. And there are others that may not pay at all. There is also the potential for more property tax appeals, as well as potential state legislative action and potential future federal COVID-19 response packages. EWEB SILT, or contribution in lieu of taxes. As of mid-April, EWEB had experienced an approximate 5% drop in retail sales due to the current event. SILT revenues are estimated to be almost $140,000 lower in fiscal year 20 and almost $300,000 lower in FY 21. These actions equate to a 5% decrease in SILT revenue through December 2020. And then operating revenues. As programs and services have been modified or experienced interrupted operations due to facility closures, we are projecting revenue reductions in recreation services, municipal court, and library services. In total, operating revenues for these service areas have been reduced $1.1 million in FY 20 and $1 million in FY 21, with the assumption that normal revenue levels will return in FY 22. And then we are also looking at interest on investments. Recent market volatility has caused rates to fall, with rates staying low for some time. As the city reinvests maturing investments in cash, it will be at much lower rates. Based on our experience with the Great Recession, even when rates do start to rise, it will be some time before our portfolio rate rises to pre-COVID levels. Dropping rates from 1.75% to just under 0.5% through the forecast period results in a revenue reduction of just over $330,000 in FY 21 and a total reduction of $3.3 million over the full forecast period. Next slide, please. General fund revenues are largely driven by property taxes, which are determined by total taxable assessed value of property in Eugene. As you can see here, prior to the recession, the annual growth in taxable assessed property value was trending higher before experiencing a sharp drop in FY11. Since that time, the annual increases trended upwards, although annual growth rates remain below pre-recession levels. While our taxable property value for FY20 increased by 3.9%, building activity remained high, and we were projecting a 4% growth rate through the forecast period in the pre-COVID budget, which is represented by the green line. Using our experience from the Great Recession as a guide, staff projected property values to dip along a similar trajectory with a low growth rate of 2.5% in FY23, slowly climbing back up to 4% by the end of the forecast period as represented by the red line. This trajectory was in line with generally with the initial assumptions from the tax assessor and results in a reduction of revenue of $15.5 million over the forecast period. However, we're getting new information all the time. And in the past week, the tax assessor's office has released revised guidance, and we've modeled slower growth rates as shown by the yellow line. In this scenario, growth slows to just 2% in FY23 and takes longer to rebound. Under this scenario, there's an additional $10.2 million impact to the general fund over the forecast period. So the second factor impacting property tax revenues in the forecast is the collection rate. For the past several years, we have kept the assumed collection rate at 94.5%, which is aligned with actual experience as indicated by the solid blue line on the chart, increasing the assumed collection rate to 95% in FY20. As a reminder, this was related to the statewide property tax settlement reached between the state of Oregon and Comcast in fiscal year 18. The general fund's share of the settlement was approximately $2.8 million. Starting back in fiscal year 12, Comcast began deferring property tax payments after appealing its valuation. The blue dotted line shows an estimate of what our collection rate would have been if Comcast had not deferred payments. And you can see this line hovers around 95%, which was the assumption in the pre-COVID-19 proposed budget, represented by the green line. Initial guidance from the tax assessor's office assumed the collection rate would drop 1 to 2%. The amended budget forecast assumed reduced collection rates of 94% in FY20 and 93% in FY21 before rebounding incrementally to 95% in FY25, represented by the red line. Within the last week, the guidance from the assessor's office indicates that the collection rate could fall 6 to 7% in FY21, as shown by the yellow line. This projection is related to provisions in the Federal CARES Act, where mortgage payers can temporarily suspend payments for up to 12 months. While we won't know what our experience will be in Eugene, the impact to revenues in FY21 of a 90% collection rate would be a decrease of $5.8 million in that year. While we would expect to recover some of this tax revenue at a point in the future, how much and when are unknown at this time. If both yellow scenarios played out of a low FY21 collection rate of 90% and low taxable assessed value growth, the impact to the general fund over the forecast period is a reduction of $36.8 million, which is $14.3 million more than under the amended budget forecast assumptions. So now I'll cover general fund expenses briefly. So personnel services comprise nearly 80% of the general fund operating budget, with materials and services making up the remaining 20%. Material and services costs are expected to increase by 3% in FY21, or about $1 million. We are a service organization, and it takes people to deliver the suite of services we provide to the community, resulting in such a large component of our operating budget to personnel. Personnel services includes costs such as wages, healthcare, and PERS. Personnel service costs are projected to increase by $6.1 million, or about 5% compared to the previous year. Retirement costs, which include PERS, are projected to increase 13.6%, or $3 million. Actually, 13.6%. I will get you the number. Excuse me. They're projected to increase $13.6 million, or 3%. Thank you. This includes the PERS EIF payment of $3.1 million under the proposed budget. PERS rates are updated every 2 years and will increase in FY22. PERS is estimating that PERS rates will increase 3% system-wide in FY24 based upon market performance this year due to the pandemic. The actual rate increase may be lower if returns are better in the next year. Based on this information, we have incorporated a 3% increase to PERS and OPSRPS rates beginning in FY24. This action increases ongoing personnel expenses by $2.4 million annually. Usually the city doesn't have any influence over rates set by the PERS board, but has a unique opportunity to lower PERS rates through the Employer Incentive Fund. Next slide. Oh, perfect. So at your February workshop, I provided an update on PERS and the Employer Incentive Fund, or EIF. The EIF was initially funded with $100 million to provide matching funds for any eligible employer that makes a lump sum payment of at least $25,000 over their required PERS contribution. The EIF will match 25% of that lump sum amount. So if we deposit $8 million, we would receive an additional 2 for a total deposit of 10. Once the deposit is made, there's an immediate rate offset to lower the rate, which reduces PERS costs. For deposits of 10 million or more, the agency can choose their amortization period of 6, 10, 16, or 20 years, which will impact the rate offset amount. Last September, the City of Eugene was part of the first group of employers eligible to apply for matching funds from the EIF. Our application was to deposit up to 8 million, reserving up to $2 million for the deposit of 10. The city is not obligated to make the deposit and can receive matching funds for any amount deposited from $25,000 to up to the $8 million cap. The original rule stated that we must make the deposit by August of 2020 in order to receive our matching funds. However, due to the uncertain environment we are currently operating in, the PERS board is expected to take action at their May 29th meeting to extend the deposit deadline to December of 2020 to allow jurisdictions more time to evaluate the current economic environment before making their deposits. Next slide. So we talked about this in February, but it's worth repeating. There are many things to think about when we're considering making a lump sum payment. The first is the opportunity for matching funds. Pre-COVID and post-COVID, I couldn't invest city funds anywhere and get a 25% return. This is also an opportunity for us to take action. Through this deposit, there's an opportunity to increase our assets and lower our unfunded actuarial liability and lower our PERS rates with an immediate impact on rates in 21. This mechanism usually isn't available to us. And there's also our bond rating when we consider our fiscal stewardship. The city has a very high bond rating of AA1, which translates into lower borrowing costs for taxpayers. Moody's, our rating agency, is very concerned about the pension liability jurisdictions across the country are facing and is watching the decisions being made to mitigate future liability. We have been advised by our financial advisor to make the maximum contribution possible to the EIF since we were able to secure matching funds. We should take some action as it would be seen as unfavorable not to take advantage of this opportunity and could put us at jeopardy for a rating downgrade the next time we go to issue bonds and request a rating. And finally, determining EIF participation and the amount of lump sum deposit involves weighing competing priorities and the financial risk and impacts to the service system as a whole. This point has changed considerably given the COVID and the uncertainty of our current economic situation. Next slide. So the FY21 proposed budget includes an $8 million deposit to leverage $2 million in state funds for the total deposit of 10, which we would propose to amortize over 10 years. By choosing the 10-year amortization, our PERS rates are expected to decrease by about 1.08%, which equates to a $13 million savings across all funds over the 10-year period, or a net savings of $5 million. We analyzed the various options using our own data in conjunction with the PERS employer rate projection tool to settle on the current recommendation, which will be revisited in the fall before a final EIF decision is made. By incorporating this strategy into the forecast, this one-time investment lowers costs and creates financial capacity in the system to achieve other goals over this time frame. The sources of funding for this deposit include $2.9 million from the Other Post-Employee Benefits, or OPEB fund. These funds were set aside for future retirement costs in 2009. We've confirmed with our auditor that using these funds to reduce PERS costs for all funds is an appropriate use of this reserve. The remaining $5.1 million is spread proportionally across city funds with personnel expenses, with the general fund share at about $3 million. I recognize this is a different world than when the proposed budget was created, and there is much uncertainty as we look to the future. As I mentioned earlier, we expect the PERS board to allow deposits to be made until December, which gives us more time to gain experience in our new world and understand more of what the economic impacts on our financial condition will actually be. While we have identified up to an $8 million deposit to secure the match, with our application, we can decide to invest a lower amount should actual fiscal impacts or increased uncertainty make it not fiscally prudent to invest the whole amount. The FY21 proposed budget currently budgets the deposit at the $8 million level. Staff will monitor our situation with the goal of being able to deposit $8 million, but at a minimum, we would recommend depositing $3 million, the amount in the OPEB fund. After further analysis in the early fall, including an updated actuarial valuation to determine the actual PERS offset rate with a December deposit date, staff would make a recommendation to be presented to council before taking any action. Any budget adjustments to a change in strategy would be incorporated on the supplemental budget in December. And here I'd like to talk just a bit about the Community Safety Initiative funding. Chief Skinner will speak more later this evening on the strategy, but I did want to talk about the change in funding strategy as it impacts the amended budget forecast. The community safety payroll tax will be implemented in January 2021 as originally planned. However, there is uncertainty regarding the revenue levels that will be achieved due to the current economic impact to the community from COVID-19, as well as increased fiscal pressures to the general fund. To address these new developments, the loan to fund services until payroll taxes are collected has been reduced to $4.7 million and will come from the Fleet Services Fund rather than the general fund. This funding will be supplemented by a one-time transfer of $2 million from the general fund. Additionally, the $3 million general fund loan budgeted in fiscal year 20 is not needed as expenditures have been lower than initially forecast this fiscal year as service delivery has started to ramp up. So the loan will not be utilized. Next slide. So to understand the impact of key changes on the amended forecast and additional actions that will need to be taken, we'll look first at the surplus deficit and then at the reserve for revenue shortfall. The annual operating surplus deficit helps us understand if we're living within our means. Do we have a stable service system where revenues are greater than or equal to expenditures? I'm going to show you a few lines one at a time so that we can compare the FY21 proposed budget forecast against the amended forecast. First, I'd like to point out that the red dotted line in the middle of the chart, which represents a neutral position where revenues equal expenditures. Anything above the red line is a surplus, and anything below the red line is a deficit. The result of a surplus is an increase in reserves, while a deficit reduces reserves. So the solid blue line shown here shows the forecasted surplus deficit as of the proposed budget before COVID-19. The low FY21 level reflects loaning $9 million to the Community Safety Initiative from the Reserve for Revenue Shortfall, which is repaid as shown by the spike in FY22. The surplus is drawn down in the short term, but returns to a surplus position by the end of the forecast period, in part due to the EIF contribution, which lowers PERS rates over the forecast and costs over the forecast period. The red dotted line shown here represents the current forecast, which includes the updates we've talked about to key revenue drivers, incorporates the revised budget actions, and includes the $8 million PERS EIF contribution and related offset, as well as removing the loans for community safety from the general fund. Also included in this line is $750,000 in ongoing budget reductions in the general fund that begin in FY21. The city manager will speak to these reductions a bit later this evening. As you can see, without further action, we're in a deficit position through the forecast period. And then the next line, this line is the first in a series we'll show you. So this is the amended budget forecast that incorporates additional series of budget reduction strategies in FY22, 23, and 24 to achieve returning to a surplus position and also to achieve a $4 million minimum reserve level through the forecast period. So based on this set of assumptions, it is estimated that approximately $7.6 million in ongoing reductions would need to be achieved over the 3-year period as follows. So this First year would be 2.4, and then 23, another raising to 4.1. And then finally in FY24, you can see with the $7.6 million in reductions, we're in a surplus position by the end of the forecast period. This approach is scalable and avoids overcorrecting in the near term during this time of uncertainty as we learn more. So next we'll look at the reserve for revenue shortfall, which is our savings account. This reserve is our financial cushion, which is the key part of our financial management. Our current situation with the economic impacts of the pandemic are exactly why it is important to have an adequate reserve. This allows us to weather unexpected events and take time to develop thoughtful, strategic responses rather than having to take immediate action to cut services. Additionally, having a sufficient reserve is a factor in our high credit rating, which translates into lower borrowing costs for the city, saving taxpayer resources over the long term. Moody's, our credit rating agency, recognizes the strong financial management of the city, including maintaining strong reserve levels, a key metric in their valuation. I expect Moody's to be watching our approach to managing this time of uncertainty as we balance the use of reserves and taking appropriate budget actions in a timely manner to ensure financial stability. So the line you see here represents our savings account target of 8% of general fund expenditures, or about $15 million over the forecast period on average. The next line that will show, this solid blue line, shows the forecasted reserve as the proposed budget before COVID-19. Although the adopted budget reserve was projected to decrease a bit over time, it maintained about 5% by the end of the forecast period, which is under our preferred target level, but is still a reasonable reserve. And then again, this is the red dotted line. It represents our current forecast with the updates we talked about earlier, the revenue estimates, budget actions, the PERS EIF, the offset, and the community safety loans, and the $750,000 in ongoing budget reductions in FY21. As you can see, if we don't take any further action, our reserve is depleted in FY22. And then again, the green line incorporates $7.6 million in ongoing budget reduction strategies in FY22 through 26. So again, in each of those years, so there's, by the time we get to FY24 with the total of $7.6 million, we're close to being, we're about a 4% reserve at the end of the forecast period. The goal with this approach was to leave at least $4 million in the reserve for revenue shortfall to provide financial cushion against uncertainty while we work our way through the economic situation. That uncertainty includes the FCC order on Comcast, should Comcast stop paying right away revenues to the city, which I'll talk about in a moment. Under this approach, we have at least $4 million in reserve and achieve a 4% reserve for revenue shortfall target by the end of the period. This modeling is based upon assumptions known 3 weeks ago, and the world continues to shift, as we've talked about this evening, and we learn more. I say that to reiterate that these numbers will change as we know more, and the budget reduction strategy targets will be different the next time we present a forecast. Staff will continue to monitor and update frequently. So we continue to monitor areas of uncertainty related to the general fund and our financial condition. So the first is EWEB SILT. So EWEB is currently modeling scenarios with up to a 15% drop in sales as they review the possible range of outcomes due to the pandemic. A 15% drop in SILT revenues through December of 2020 would equate to about a $1.3 million reduction in the general fund. And then the FCC order and Comcast revenues, we've chatted about this before, but due to a rule change by the Federal Communications Commission that preempts local governments from imposing fees on cable operators for non-cable services. Although the rule has taken effect, Comcast is still collecting the fee from their customers and remitting payments to the city. While this action is being challenged in the courts, it is unclear when they might stop paying. This action would decrease general fund revenues by $3.5 million annually. And then property taxes. As we've discussed tonight, there will be reduced property tax revenues to some degree over the next few years based upon the factors I talked about earlier. While the amended general fund forecast property tax assumptions with lower collection rates and lower AV growth reduces general fund revenues to $22.6 million over the forecast period when compared to the original proposed budget. If we include the newest estimates from the tax assessor, revenues would drop an additional $14 million over the forecast period. We know that future PERS rates will increase in the out years due to current market conditions, and as previously discussed, there are a range of factors that impact PERS rates. Although participation in the employer incentive funds will help reduce PERS costs, it does not lock in a specific rate, but will help lower our future rates as determined by the actuary. Personnel costs. As our services are heavily dependent on personnel, personnel costs are a large component of our budget. In each of the next 3 years, contracts for our major unions will be expiring and up for renegotiation. Currently, all employee groups' wage considerations tie to CPI in the out years of the forecast. And finally, recession. This is not a when, but how deep and how long. This current event is different than the Great Recession, so while we can look to that event for reference, the impact now and our actual experience over time will be different. Long-term impacts will be shaped by events and impacts that occur over the next 18 months as we return to a new normal and a vaccine is eventually developed. So this is my last slide this evening. We've spent a lot of time talking about the general fund. There are some other funds I wanted to highlight that have been impacted by the pandemic. But first, a bit of good news. The airport has been impacted quite severely by this pandemic with a 95% drop in revenues, but they did receive a federal CARES grant of $23 million just recently. So that puts them in a much better position, and we don't have to have them on this slide this evening. So there's a bit of good news. So we'll talk briefly about each of these funds. The Cultural Services Fund, with the Halt Center closed for shows, there are no program revenues being collected, which is expected to last at least until September under the current guidance from the governor. Likewise, transient room tax revenues are not being collected. It is expected that even once people start traveling again, revenues may be low for some time as future activity is unknown. With the Road Fund, gas tax revenues will be lower due to the current stay-at-home order and reduced travel. We expect to see the first impact in the month of June, so we'll be watching. And then on the capital side, there's no immediate impact to capital projects, but staff will monitor the fund and potential impacts as we look to the future. The Professional Services Fund provides for professional engineering services performed by public works personnel for projects. Services are charged to benefiting projects, and if the future volume of anticipated projects decreases, this could create additional strain on the fund. The Construction Permit Fund, we will be watching this fund as we see what happens with local development decisions due to uncertain economic conditions, an unknown recovery window, and factors impacting overall housing inventory such as student enrollment. And then finally, we'll talk briefly about the Parking Fund and the Ambulance Transport Fund. So with the Parking Fund, with the stay-at-home order, parking revenues are down 95% since mid-March, which is expected to continue for some time. There is additional uncertainty to see the service level needed as we emerge into the new normal, as the Parking Fund is very dependent on the downtown economy. And then with the Ambulance Transport Fund, this fund has been impacted in the short term as transports to hospitals have been down significantly since March. We are starting to see a slow uptick, but it is unclear when we will return to pre-COVID levels. Both the parking and ambulance transport funds run on thin margins and are in more distress than the other funds shown here. Staff are monitoring them closely, and there may be action needed on that supplemental budget in December to provide stability and ensure a balanced budget for these funds. So with that, I'll stop here and turn it back over to the city manager.
Thank you, Twyla. I'm going to let everybody just like breathe for a second. Back one slide, and you can move
Can
it
you
forward
play
to my
some
slide.
happy music?
Well, I don't know if Mike's here, but he could sing for you.
No.
I just wanted to take a second to thank Twyla for that, and for actually just a moment of gratitude for the entire finance team for how quickly and diligently they've been working to adapt and adjust and provide this information. So you can go to the next slide. We've been talking about, so when we were originally preparing the budget, as Twyla said, I think the forecast period percent was 5.9%, which made me a little bit uncomfortable because ideally we'd like to be at that 8% but I was convinced that was an okay number, and it still allowed us to get things done that we knew were a really high priority for you and for the community. So as we've been thinking now about how to adjust, we've been using this concept, and I think it's a really good one, of making sure that in any given year we have $4 million in our reserves, which feels like not a lot, but at least is enough to give us some cushion with Comcast, and that we maintain 4% in the out years, and that those two things need to kind of stay in a balance. And I've been thinking of you as kind of the yellow triangle here. You know, if you ever remember as a kid standing in the middle and trying to kind of keep your balance, if you decide as a budget committee you actually want to invest more, you know, one-time dollars, then it can sometimes, you know, it just adjusts. Like for every $1 million in one-time funds, we lose 0.5% in the outgoing years, and it always just kind of plays this that kind of role. You can move it forward. I like that balance beam approach, because if you think about those times where you stayed like that and we're trying to kind of get your adjustment, it's a great example of times where you had really heightened awareness and you're completely present and ready, which is what we're trying to do with this year's budget. That's where we are now. That's why you're receiving amendments kind of in the same day as what we're doing with the presentation. And but it's really important that we continue to adapt as fast as we possibly can. We're going to continue monitoring. We're using all of the data that Twyla gave you, and we'll use our combined leadership experience with a recession to make those adjustments and still maintain our focus on the priorities that mattered pre-COVID. It will certainly be important as we come out. I can't imagine that community safety is going to be any less important when we reopen than it was before that. Cities around the country are really taking different approaches to their budget. I participate in an ICMA listserv, and they've opened up some new communication tools. So I've been watching what others are doing and communicating with other city managers. And people are taking a mix of approaches. Some of them are just moving forward their original budgets, knowing that they're going to have to adjust everything along the year. Some are going pretty extreme and really taking more time and kind of cutting a lot of things out. And you see that a lot in cities where they have strong sales tax revenue, and it's been really hit hard. I think our approach of starting to make some adjustments and still meet our timelines, but not totally overreact, is a really good way to go. Our approach is really to just stay ready and maintain our focus. The needs of our community, the financial stability, both of those things have to continue to stay in that balance. So you'll continue to see that as we move forward. And as I said, I feel like this budget kind of gets us to base camp. Next slide. We've been talking, you know, early on, I think maybe I started thinking about when they started talking about flattening the curve, which, you know, when it comes to the virus, flattening the curve meant making sure that we didn't have an outbreak that got bigger than what our medical resources were. So that stay home, save lives really helped flatten that, so we could, you know, contain it and make sure we had all of the right PPE and medical resources. We're trying to do the same thing financially and make sure that we're adjusting over time. And I like the way Twyla showed that, you know, we make an adjustment this year, which I'll talk about in just a second. We'll make an adjustment next year, and we'll make an adjustment next year. I think that's the responsible thing to do, given that none of us really know how this pandemic and how long it's going to last, whether there's going to be a second wave of it, and how fast or slow does the economy recover. We don't really know. And so I think it's important that we don't lose our focus on our priorities along the way, but we start to act a little bit faster. So 2 ways we're doing that. We immediately decided we needed to take a bit of a reduction this year. So this year we've built in a $750,000 reduction. And the best way I can explain that, given the timing of how fast we've had to kind of operate, is each of the departments is taking $125,000 reduction in materials and supplies. And the purpose of that is trying to not hit services and not hit staffing levels until we, you know, have a little bit more time to adjust. So department heads have asked for a little bit of flexibility for this as they move into FY21. for now, they'll take the reduction there. But if they come up with a creative, innovative way to make that ongoing adjustment, I'm totally open to that as well. I think this is a time we all want to be really creative. And we're also staying ready to make the PERS payment if we can. It makes me nervous not knowing what's out there, but we think building it in right now and planning for it, and then allowing you to make a decision later in the year will be kind of a wise, prudent way to go. It's a smart financial move if we can make it happen. And if things really deteriorate and we feel like we can't do that, we'll be making that recommendation as well. You can go to the next slide. So a few of the highlights, if you turn, I just wanted to let you know, on page 6 of your amended budget documents, I think it's page 6, there's a great chart that really just lines out so simply and clearly what's been changed in the ongoing funding and what's been changed in the one-time funding. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. And remember, all of this is around how do we keep $4 million and 4%. So climate, I was really hoping this year that we would start to be able to move some of our climate work into our ongoing budget. We know that this is not something that's going to go away. It's work that's going to need to continue. So we are shifting it from ongoing to one-time dollars, but we're continuing to make that investment in the planning and implementation, and we're continuing to make the capital investments we need to do to move, our natural gas systems to electric, our vehicle systems to electric. I think those are where we're really going to see the greenhouse gas reductions. And I just want to point out that a lot of people are pointing to this time right now and saying we should be learning from this and using this as an opportunity to see what differences we might want to make in that climate work. And I have to agree that if we don't learn from how we've been adapting right now and apply that, it would be a definite missed opportunity. You'll see downtown is still there. I think Denny's going to talk about that more in his urban renewal piece, but he's just has a lot more experience with the downtown operations. But I think we also know that while it's not the only area where businesses have been impacted, it's a commerce center for our community, and the safety and vitality is going to remain a very high priority. So we've shifted it from ongoing to one time, but it's still important. The SCBAs, so that's the breathing apparatus, the tanks and gear that the firefighters wear into really unsafe conditions, and our budget continues to fund those. It will fund it this year and also next year, and it's a mix of general fund investment and also our equipment replacement fund. So this one's an important one to me, and it will continue to stay in there. And then we've added in, you may have noticed, a $520,000 item for COVID recovery. We don't yet know what all of the recovery efforts will be, and I anticipate we may be back discussing this in supplemental budget, potentially for even more funding, just based on the unknown. But we know a few things. We know we're going to need to transition our designated temporary shelter sites. We know we're to a more sustainable long-term situation. We know that there's hand washing stations and bathrooms that potentially, we want to phase out over time. We know we're going to need to transition our mobile outreach. There's just a whole lot of things. PPE for our employees, sanitizing workspaces. Several of you have mentioned support to businesses. So we want to be prepared to do that. And what we've been doing right now is not sustainable. And it's beyond the reach of our operating budget to be able to continue doing that without some one-time dollars. And then I want to talk about the Hendricks Park thing because it seems like a small thing, but I think it's a really important point that when we were going through the recession, one of the things that came up repeatedly in the budget committee was, can't we find new ways to either get volunteers to do work or community partnerships to help pay for that? Could we raise private funds? Could we create a foundation? There was a lot of ideas about that. And this Hendricks Park partnership really emerged from some of those conversations. And it takes years to be able, for a private group to be able to raise the funds that can sustainably fund a city position over time. And so they're committed to splitting a position with us, and they're really excited about it. They've been working on it for a long time, and we're committed to still making that happen with them. So that's why that one's in there. And then we're still very committed to community safety, and I'm going to let Chief Skinner talk to you about that and some of the revised plans. he'll be here soon.
I'm on now.
There you are.
Okay, excellent. Well, good evening, Mayor, Council, and Budget Committee members. It is absolutely a pleasure to be a part of the supporting cast tonight and just be able to talk a little bit about Community Safety Initiative. I want to just thank you first and foremost just for your unwavering support of what we're trying to do around community safety. And that's not just about the police department, it's about a whole host of services that we need to make us a safer community. And that really, really means a lot to our economic development and just kind of the economic engine of the city to make sure that we're all safe and feeling safe in our community. So thank you for that unwavering support. We are going to implement the payroll taxes plan so far. Now, there was a time when we were going through this where we were a little bit frustrated about how long it felt like it was going to take to be able to collect these funds. But now in hindsight with the COVID pandemic, what a blessing that we've had the extra time to be able to have some experience in this pandemic time and with the economic downturn to see how we're going to respond as a community and respond as an economy. And so we are feeling very, very comfortable about the January 1st, 2021 implementation date so far, but we will continue to monitor what we think is appropriate based on how our economy recovers between now and then. And as always, we'll always adjust our revenue projections for the two major factors that play a role in that, and that is the percentage of revenues that we can collect, so our success in being able to actually collect revenues, and then the available or the eligible payrolls that we can get the payroll tax on. And so those are ongoing adjustments that we'll make, and we will continue to do that analysis over the next several months and even into 2021 so that we can make sure that we have a reasonable and realistic expectations for our revenue forecasts. One of the things that we've been really, really committed to is trying to shrink what community safety, what the liability to our general fund was going to be around the money that we're borrowing for community safety in the interim. And you heard Twyla talk a little bit about the general fund, $2 million from the general fund and about $4.7 million from interfund loan from Fleet Services Fund. And that is significantly smaller than the original $9.5 to $9.7 million that we were hoping to be able to carry us into FY21. So we're being responsible about what we can do. And what we've basically tried to do is fall back to the original bridge funding commitment that was made by council and supplemental budget almost 18 months ago, and really make sure that we can promises made, promises kept in that moment in time, and really do a good job of implementing the bridge funding. And I'm happy to report that so many great things have happened within that bridge funding, and we're committed to continuing with that in FY21 and continuing to make a difference in our community. The other thing that's really nice about the way we've developed the Community Safety Initiative is that we have room for ramp up. We have room to be able to grow as we see the economy recover and as we see our collections increase. And so there's no reason to implement this all in a year. We have always talked about being mindful of how quickly we can actually hire and train people throughout the entire initiative, and when it makes sense to bring people on and the right people to be bringing on at the right time in our strategy. And so there really is a lot of room for ramp up. And so I feel very, very comfortable, and I think we all feel very, very comfortable about that strategic plan around how we implement the Community Safety Initiative. So just a little bit of high-level highlights of our Community Safety Initiative. I will end with just saying our police department are to be able to say that we're in that positive position as we look at some of the challenges that we face. So thank you very much. Sarah?
Thank you, Chief. Really appreciate that perspective, and a good reminder for how respectful you are when you greet everybody, mayor and council and budget committee members, which I didn't do. I just jumped into the presentation. So thanks for that reminder. Also going to jump into just a few highlights of some of the other non-general funds. That list, if you want to follow along with the list, is also on page 9. I'm not going to go into a deep level of detail on this either, but I'm really glad that we talked about all the other funds, because I think this is really different than the recession, where we were really, really focused on the general fund, and actually some of the other funds absorbed some of the costs and employees of that. And we had a lot of flexibility, which we know we won't have as much this time, but there's still some great things that are going to happen. So if you look at that, there's, we're still moving forward with our capital projects and the engineering staff and other staff we need to make sure that those move forward and that we have promises made and promises kept. We're continuing with a Public Works right-of-way cleanup team. That's been really, I think that's a really important thing to implement. We've had to take people off of our street sweepers and other equipment to be able to clean up the right-of-way, and it's impacting services to our stormwater system. So I think it's really important. We're continuing forward with some wastewater projects and a wastewater custodian. We're continuing forward with funding our corporate system upgrade, which is really the backbone of how everything internally happens around payroll and finance and budget and purchasing. And it's been a really big project. We've talked to you about that before, and it's been happening over a number of years. And I think we're going to also continue to get ready with a Holt Center strategy that I'm going to ask Renee to jump in and explain to you. If you're there, Renee, you're muted.
I was telling you I was coming, but that doesn't help when you're muted. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, Mayor, Council, and Budget Committee. We really do appreciate you and the time that you're taking. Out of all the stories that you've been hearing around the lack of revenues and our budget forecast, as Sarah said, there are some really good stories. And one of those is the work that the Holt Center staff has been doing in the Cultural Services Subfund. Over the last 4 or 5 years, they've actually seen unprecedented increases in their activity, the number of audience members and their revenues. And in fact, their revenues have increased over 100% during that time, which is the really good news because right now we're needing those really good times. They have been running with really healthy reserves. As part of the standard operating procedures, the Cultural Services Subfund has a 4-month operating reserve in recognition partially of the kind of volatile nature of the performing arts. And so that actually has been a silver lining in all of this, that we've been able to run off of those reserves. So initially, we're going to present to you this 5-year business plan that will continue to build on the success. Because of all the changes that we've been seeing here recently, we're adjusting that to, as Sarah said, more of a business readiness plan that's going to leverage the Holt Center's role in assisting Eugene's recovery through revenue back initiatives, and that also help us increase our community resilience. And I would just like to go on and say that because of the amount of uncertainty, things are changing every day, as you've been hearing. This plan increases spending authority to address new and expanded opportunities, but it does not assume that the expenditure of these funds will happen. The expenditures will be driven by demand and will be initiated when and if the revenues are able to support the new initiatives. You see on your picture here on your screen, one of the most significant decisions driving this new revenue is that we are moving toward presenting Broadway and commercial touring programs in-house. Up till now, we've been using a third-party presenter to perform this function. This change in independence keeps both the programming decisions and the revenues local, and allows us to better connect our programs to our community need and demographics. By our conservative estimates, we anticipate that the annual revenues will increase by 1.4 million with this change. Also, this might be hard for you to believe, it is for me, the Holt Center is coming up on its 40th birthday, and we're committed to continuing the stewardship of this facility. It's one of our gems in the downtown. It's key to our economic recovery. And it's one of those things that will inspire and resonate with our community as we move forward. So we recognize that it's important to do our part in lifting the human spirit today. That's a big part of the things that are happening through cultural services. And while we know that the future is a little rocky, maybe not certain, we're doing this in a way that doesn't expose the city to undue risk, and still being able to adapt and be flexible and ready when the time comes to be prepared to start this new plan. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Renee.
Are you just teasing us with the Hamilton picture?
Possibly.
It's an Easter egg. So next slide. I want to talk about the TAC report and some of the services we provide to the unsheltered. One of the things I really love about the budget the last couple of years are the city focus sections. So if you're looking through your original budget, I think it's page 45 has a really great section on kind of our focus on homeless and human services. But I want to talk about the TAC report and the navigation center a little bit, because I think it represents future possibility and also some problem solving we're going to need to do together. So when the TAC report was completed in January of 2019, and in July of 2019, the City Council allocated $1.9 million to a set of the strategies, not all of the strategies, but to the purchase of the capital investment in a 75-bed low barrier shelter and navigation center, piloting of a mobile outreach team, hiring a several-year limited duration joint housing shelter strategist. So, we started the mobile outreach as part of this COVID response. We've been learning a lot from that. And we've hired the shelter strategist who's been helping also with this COVID response. And we're continuing there's a couple other strategies, but I'll just talk about those. And we're continuing to work on the navigation center. So in the TAC report, the numbers that were given for that were that the capital investment would be somewhere between, if you looked across the country, it was anywhere from $700 to $2.4 million, with 1.6, I think, being about the average. So we allocated just under $900,000, or right around $900,000 for that portion of the structure. At the time we built this budget, we didn't have a location for it, and the business plan was pretty unclear for me. So the TAC report shared that they thought that the ongoing operating costs per year were about $700,000, somewhere around that range. When I started in this role kind of early in the year, Lane County had said they thought those numbers were closer to $3 million. And even just as recently as last week, revised that, which I think is appropriate, down to about $1.9 million. So it's significantly more than what we presented to you in the original plan of what it will actually cost to run that shelter. So this budget does not have that allocation to operating the shelter. My thoughts were, when we were kind of aggressively at the beginning of the year and still actively looking for a site and hoping to get it open by November, we were also working really closely with Lane County on trying to get funds from the state to help at least get it up and going for the first couple of years. And we thought that was really promising during the short session. And then that all came to kind of a stop with COVID. One of the things that Lane County has been able to do is, we were looking at a couple of sites. Lane County actually used this opportunity to purchase one of the sites, the site on River Avenue, as I won't get the wording of this right, but it was really to be kind of a medical respite facility for some of our most vulnerable population. And the thinking being that they could then convert that over into being the low barrier navigation center, and potentially be a behavioral center. So they move forward with that. The Army Corps of Engineers has been helping them with some remodeling. And Steve was actually able to build $1 million, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's somewhere around $1.3 million in ongoing funds to fund what would be sort of the county's 50% share of that. There's been some discussion about that partnership with the city and whether it's a 50% share or not a 50% share. Finding $1 million in ongoing funds is going to be a challenge for us. And these are the reasons why I think it's really important for us to do strategic planning, because if this is going to be one of our highest priorities, we'll need to find a way to be able to help do that. And I'll still be pushing for us to be looking at the state and some other resources for that, because it's a pretty heavy lift. And it's not the only thing we're doing. So the TAC recommendations are meant to be kind of a 5-year plan to get us to functional zero. It's very, very important, really great work, but it also doesn't include some of the other things that we do. So it doesn't include the rest stops, Opportunity Village. It doesn't include the car camping, and some of the things that I think we at least have felt have been innovative new solutions and are really helping during times like right now, but aren't part of that kind of overall funding package and aren't being seen as part of that navigation center. So I just think we have some work to do going forward, and I want to highlight it because I don't want to leave it unspoken, because it is a really high priority, and I just couldn't figure out how we could free up that amount of ongoing funding right now at this exact time. So with that, I'm going to shift it to kind of our last, not our last slide, but we're going to move over just briefly to the urban renewal budget, and Denny's going to talk through that in downtown.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, Mayor, councilors, Budget Committee members. Great to have you here. Thanks for weathering yet another Zoom meeting. I'm Denny Bro, the Planning and Development Director. I'm going to talk about our urban renewal districts and the overall downtown operations. And usually we do a deep dive on urban renewal, but tonight we're just going to kind of hit some highlights. If you want to do a deep dive on tax increment financing and urban renewal, we'd be happy to connect with you one-on-one to bring you up to speed. But tonight we're just going to kind of hit the highlights. We have 2 urban renewal districts. We have a downtown urban renewal district and a riverfront district, and they operate as special tax increment financing districts. They are separate legal entities. They're governed by an urban renewal agency, and the council plays the role of the urban renewal agency and the urban renewal agency board. And they operate under, in this case, each under urban renewal plans. In each case, each district has an urban renewal plan. We have some exciting and yet some challenging work going on in both of our districts. So I just want to provide a quick update on where we are in some of the projects. And I'm going to start with the riverfront district. As many of you know, we've been working on plans to transform our downtown riverfront for about 20 years. It's a long held vision to reconnect downtown to the river. And over the past year, we've continued to make tremendous progress. The Urban Renewal Agency owns all of the former eWeb property along the river, with the exception of the eWeb admin building. And if you look at the image on the left there, all of that scraped kind of brown property there is the Urban Renewal Agency's riverfront property that we're working on currently. We're implementing the riverfront master plan. I think we have a great concept plan that includes a downtown riverfront park. We've designed the infrastructure, which includes the streets and everything needed to connect the site and the development in the park, including the quiet zone crossings. We've been working with Portland-based developer Williams & Dame for a couple years now. We're currently working with them to update the terms of the development agreements, and council is going to actually be looking at those updated terms later this month. The exciting news is that we've signed a contract and for the construction of the riverfront park, and the work is already underway. We'll have a great riverfront park next year. So sometime in March, the park is expected to be complete, and that's just going to be awesome. We also have gone out to bid for the infrastructure build out for the site, which again will connect the site to the park and the development, all the roads and infrastructure. The low bid that we received was under our estimate, so that was really good news. And council will be considering basically next week, whether to move forward with the first phase of that infrastructure. And if that's approved, work will soon start on the first phase of the infrastructure and be completed by the end of the year, and it'd be ready to serve the park at that point. The other urban renewal districts is our downtown urban renewal district, which is basically the core of our downtown. The focus of most of that work has been on the town square project, which includes the downtown park blocks and the butterfly parking garage site that we hope to transform into a town square. That would include a permanent home for the farmers market, redesigned park blocks, and a new city hall. Today, we've worked with the design team to develop conceptual designs for the park blocks and the farmers market space. That image on the right there on the screen is a concept for the farmers market pavilion. And later this month, we'll be at council discussing possible next steps for the town square. And we have, at this point, generally paused work on the town square until we get further direction from council, but we are currently kind of finalizing the cost estimates, particularly for the farmers market and the park blocks parts of the project, because those are ahead of the City Hall conceptual design work. I should also mention that in the downtown district, we recently purchased the old Lane Community College building on Willamette Street that's been vacant for many years. Redevelopment of that building is a specific project in our downtown urban renewal plan. We didn't use urban renewal funds to purchase the property. We actually used our community development block grant funds to purchase that. And we're treating it as a land bank site, and we're targeting mixed income, affordable housing, workforce housing project for that property. And it's possible we might consider using some downtown urban renewal investments for that property, but we'll see. Our next step really in that project is the developer request for proposals process for development of that site. Moving on to the downtown operations. Downtown operations is really the term that we use for the programs and the services that help make downtown a great place. And it's not really limited to only the urban renewal district areas. It's really all of our downtown. The downtown operations budget supports safe, vibrant, and welcoming downtown, working basically in 5 key areas: public safety and social services, physical improvements, events and programming, economic development, and communications. The downtown ops budget primarily includes the downtown manager position, downtown ambassadors, events and programming, safety, day storage, and marketing downtown, amongst a few other things. And if you've been downtown over the past couple of months, it's pretty obvious that it's become very empty and very inactive. And so we know that it's going to take a lot of work to bring it back to life. And the downtown ops focus on safety, programming, and overall management, I think, will be essential when it comes back to life. So our hope, as Sarah mentioned, was that this would be the year that we could move away from one-time funding, because we have experienced how important this work has been in creating a downtown experience that is positive and can be enjoyed by the community. It's also helping create an environment where people will want to continue to invest and work downtown and so forth. So it would have been nice to move away from the one-time funding this year. But however, given the financial uncertainties we're currently experiencing, we're again proposing to utilize one-time funding for downtown operations. And although we would like to be having conversations about expanding and normalizing these services, we're basically proposing an approach that generally allows us to replicate the most critical and successful things that we did this past year. So generally, you'll see it's the status quo that if you compare to last year. There might be some changes because we just don't know how reopening and recovery is going to look downtown, specifically around some of our programming events. Specifically regarding the downtown programming, the plans are to build off the proven and successful programming and events from the previous years. We have to remain flexible, however, to respond to emergency needs and related to our community safety and recovery. And we'll be putting the community safety first when we think about programming, obviously. And we're likely to kind of ramp up program when it's safe to do so. But I think it's going to be very important in helping our downtown community cover those programming events. So the 3 main things that we'll focus on regarding program downtown will include increasing partnerships, really to help the community engage and re-engage and being a vital part of downtown again. Ambience and placemaking, and we're going to talk about utilizing the programs such as lunch hour performances to support more business hour activity, placemaking initiatives to support restaurants with expanded footprints and so forth that will be required, and outdoor seating that might be required in response to the COVID situation. And still move forward some signature events, although they might look different. They're going to be offering communities opportunities to really celebrate and reconnect and so forth. So we'll do those signature events again when people can gather safely. So The specific list of these programs and events is pending, but they'll be refined as we navigate this pandemic and finish off the FY21 budget process. So that's all I have, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Denny. And I'd like to give a special shout out to our downtown ambassadors who have also been part of our mobile outreach teams and reaching out to some of our unsheltered people and making sure they have the supplies they need, that they're getting medical attention if they need medical attention. And I just think it's a great example of everyone rising to the occasion. Next slide. So we're into the appendix, so we're almost there. We've been working every year to improve the UNA, and I'm actually sort of embarrassed that I'm as excited about something with an acronym of UNA. But this year we made some improvements to really put things into categories of things we know are really high priorities, especially to the city council. So it just makes it easier to track instead of trying to follow by department. So those categories are climate recovery, community livability and resiliency, safe community, housing and homelessness, and effective and transparent government. So if you get a chance to look through there, I think you'll find it's a lot easier to follow along with the things you care about. And that brings us to our last slide. You know, I forgot to mention earlier that if you're wondering why this presentation has gone from really professional looking graphics to the hand-drawn ones, it's because I drew the hand-drawn ones. I was using them as an example during an earlier discussion and people liked them, so we just put them back in. But you know, we are in a new world. None of us expected to be here, but there's some things that will remain unchanged, and that is our commitment to services, our commitment to this community, our commitment to our employees, and our commitment to our financial stewardship. That's just not going to change. You know, as I've said, I feel like we have created base camp, a place we can be. We still have a lot of challenge ahead of us, like a big peak maybe, but we have the resources we need. We have the right team of people together, and we have the right safety ropes in place to get there. I have been talking a lot about the drama triangle. So, you know, the drama triangle is when people get into conflict or stress, they tend to behave from places or react from places of blame, attack, victim, or martyr, and that the most healthy functional teams come from a place of being open, resourceful, and persistent. And that's kind of the approach and values that we will take as a team going forward, is that, you know, we're gonna meet a challenge, and we're gonna stay curious and stay open and try to continue solving it, because the community is too important for us not to do it. So, I guess I will just last say, we've been here before. We've been through something like this before, and I think we can look around and see how we went through it and we recovered from it. And I know that will be true today too. So I really look forward to your comments and how you will guide this and give us your feedback and your advice, and take what we've done and make it better. Thank you.
Thank you, City Manager and Twyla and all the others for everything that you presented to us. We're going to move into the committee discussion portion of the meeting now. We're going to start with a round robin session. I'm going to follow the order of the list that was sent out on Monday. I'm currently showing that Councilors Clark and Evans are not present, so I'll be skipping over them. But if they pop in, I will certainly add them back into the order that we posted previously. After a round robin session, we'll go into a traditional queue. Ty is going to be helping me out. We're going to be using the chat feature to keep a running list of who is in the queue. Please raise your hand with the electronic tab on the participant list. That should kind of order people in on when they raise their hand. Try to be patient with us. This is going to be a little bit more challenging than normal. We'll try to make sure I'm getting everybody in the order that they come up in. Also, please do not use the chat function as a means for any side conversations. Just want to limit it to the queue. You'll have 3 minutes. That'll be visible on the screen on the timer there, and staff will mute you when when time runs out. If during this round robin, please share any of your initial thoughts, comments, questions. If you already have some intended motions, that's a great time, or other areas of information that you think that you'd like to have some more information on with our really shortened series of meetings. We really need to give staff as much time as they can to compile this stuff. So if you are able to give any indication tonight on intended motions, that'll help the process next week. With that, I will recognize first Councilor Zelenka, then followed by Ryan.
Yeah, thanks. Ty, there's two of you in the thing, but only one of you gets to talk. Sarah, your team's done a great job of pulling this together. Thank you for this very thoughtful, albeit kind of depressing presentation. But we all kind of knew it was coming, so it wasn't much of a surprise. So I don't really have any comments. I think that we need to work through this. And I think you laid out a pretty good plan for to get us through and into the near term. Seeing a potential of $25 million deficit over another 5 years is kind of startling, but I think that putting together a plan and making sure that we can work through that without having too much disruption to the services to the city and the citizens is really what we're trying to do. And I applaud you for the work that you've done there. Hopefully Congress will come through and with some money in this next round of stimulus package that help the states and the cities, and we can, that'll help dig out of the hole that every city and every county and every state in the country is in. So thank you for the hard work that you guys have done.
Thank you.
All right.
Ryan Moore and then Alicia.
Good. Yes, echoing Councilor Zelenka, thank you so much. Something I really appreciate is how explicitly the changes between the proposed and amended budgets are called out. It makes this whole process much easier, and I can only imagine the amount of work you all are constantly putting in trying to keep pace with the constant changes. With that especially, a conversation that has been happening over the past months is getting the budget committee involved in the supplemental budget process. I think considering how jam-packed the upcoming supplemental process is going to be, maybe that extra support would be especially helpful, especially considering, you know, the PERS Employee Incentive Fund. If that contribution is going to rise out of the supplemental budget process in December, and that process also happens in December, that's a really tight turnaround. So maybe more hands on deck would help. Maybe it's too many chefs in the kitchen. It's just something to think about. I have some notes here. Give me one moment. I do have a question for staff. So these temporary shelter sites have sort of been set up in different places around the community. What fund are those being provided for from? And there may not be an immediate answer. I'm sort of still digesting everything too.
No, there's an immediate answer. I mean, we've dipped into some reserves of funds to pay for things in the emergency. So in this case, I think some of the ways we've paid for the emergency is with our risk funds. Some of it has been with reserves from other funds. It's not sustainable for the long term. And we're hoping that we get some amount of reimbursement to either be able to apply forward to maintaining that or replenish those funds.
Gotcha. Thank you. Second question. So arising out of the last supplemental budget process, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think council allocated an additional $500,000 to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Was that in the supplemental process? I think it was.
Yes, that's correct. It was in a supplemental budget. It was use of the marginal beginning working capital.
Okay. And this is probably because I haven't had time to digest fully the amended budget. So I'm sorry if this is a simple question. the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, it looked to me like that's been rolled into the permit and fees fund.
That's the reporting fund. There's actually a standalone sub-fund within that reporting fund dedicated for the Affordable Housing Trust.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was hoping. Okay.
Yeah.
I believe that's the end of my questions for now. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Alicia, then Councilor Taylor.
For putting together this very thoughtful presentation, very clear mitigation plan to the situation we find ourselves in. My question is more along the lines of bond funding as a mitigation tool to the gap that we find ourselves facing. Is bond funding an option for the general fund? That's my first question. And then a follow-up question is, with the issuance in June, is there also an opportunity to refinance any current bonds that we have given the low interest rates?
So generally we don't borrow for operational costs. We borrow more on the capital side. So while the city does have a very low debt burden, typically, unless it was a short-term strategy for an ongoing funding source coming later or something like that, we would not borrow. We might borrow internally in between funds if funds were available, but we wouldn't generally go externally for a bond for operational needs. And then your second question, or your first question, was around the issuance of bonds?
Yes, is there an opportunity to refinance an existing debt we have outstanding given the low interest rates?
We haven't looked recently. We have a financial advisor we work with from time to time, and when we are going out for bonds, we always look to see if there's that opportunity. If you're talking about the potential issuance of bonds for the river infrastructure, we're not doing it. That wouldn't be through a public sale. That would be through a RFP with a private placement per advice from our financial advisor. So we have not undertaken that analysis at this time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Councilor Taylor, then Councilor Pryor.
Thank you. I didn't get an agenda for this meeting. I don't think I did, but I don't know when the break is. Usually we have a break sometime. My dog was here for a while and she got bored and left, in spite of the fact that Sarah's presentation was very well done. But my dog Lucy didn't appreciate it. We've talked in the past, some past budget committee members have brought up, the people who are no longer here have brought up the need for new sources of revenue. And I'm thinking this may be a good time to think again about new sources of revenue, not the same old ones, but new ones. And I'll pass for the rest of it. Thank you.
All right, Councilor Pryor, followed by Eliza.
Thank you. I am really kind of overwhelmed by the resilience of the budget that you have proposed. I mean, I looked at the original budget and what we're proposing to do, and I think it's really good in terms of trying to be accountable and responsible, but still reflect the goals and priorities. And so if I were to say in 30,000 foot terms, what my interest would be, it is, yes, it's okay to use one-time money in a triage kind of situation if that's what we're confronted with. While I don't want to do it for a long time, I recognize sometimes extraordinary circumstances require the use of a little bit of one-time funding in that specific situation. The second thought I had was that as you look at reprioritizing the budget, recognize that the human side and the safety side, at least in the short term, are the immediate goals. We need to make sure this budget does as much as it possibly can to support the public safety, and public response. And if that means having to defer a little bit of the physical or capital side of things, you know, I know we have to maintain balance, but as I said, in the short term, it's the people that come first. And then we can then have a conversation, a strategic one, which I agree with, about how we can then bring back in the physical and capital side. So I think your budget is trying to go there. And I think particularly with regard to the human services funding, which has a ripple effect through all of the other agencies, we look at that side of it as maybe the triage element that we need to really be aware of, at least in the short term.
All right, thank you. I apologize. Councilor Syra, are you ready to go? You're next up on the list, and then Eliza. I apologize about that.
No worries. Thank you, Chair. So apologies for being late. I had a conflict with the Lane Area Commission on Transportation, which I chair, and we were having our first virtual meeting, and I felt obligated to be there to help us handle that. So I will, of course, go back and watch the part of the meeting I missed tonight. So I don't have a lot of comments to make. I'm heartened by the comments I'm hearing so far in terms of people's responses to the city manager's amended budget. And I'm sure I'll have more to say at our future meetings. So thank you.
All right, now Eliza, followed by Councilor Semple.
So first off, I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you've done on this. I know this has been intense and challenging and difficult and just so much effort. And it's been sort of impressive to kind of see people rise to that. The revisions to the proposed budget, I think, show a very measured response, and I really appreciate that. I have, for a while, I think, been concerned because I feel like our budget, while it's been balanced, hasn't necessarily been sustainable. We have a very long unfunded needs assessment. We had a number of things that were coming out of short-term funding or the reserves that were actually ongoing things. I was really heartened in the draft budget to see that shift of moving those ongoing needs into ongoing funding. And I think it's really reasonable to pause that strategy right now with all the uncertainty. The other thing I've been pretty concerned about actually since December is that the whole time I've been on budget committee, thanks to the Comcast settlement, we have had well more in our reserve for revenue shortfall than we needed, than was that 8%. And in the supplemental budget process, that dropped quite a lot. And it feels like that rainy day is here. And we drew down that rainy day fund right before the rain. And so I don't quite know how to address that, but I think acknowledging that a lot of that reserves was going to things that we're going to need to keep funding in the long term, and now that's a little bit of a sticky place to be. I want to appreciate the difficultness of the decisions that have already been made regarding what to preserve, what to spend more on, where we need to tighten our belts as we confront this. I know that one of the goals is to make sure that those ongoing critical strategies, particularly surrounding safety, housing, homelessness, climate, don't get dropped, don't get set back through all of this. And many of those strategies are going to be critical as our recovery, as part of our recovery as well. I see that being carried forward with some of the climate funding, particularly, you know, it's going back to one time, but it's still there. And so I really appreciate that. I have some questions about some of the other areas, which I may need a second round for. So I'll, rather than start and have to stop, I'll just stop and ask for a second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilor Semple, followed by Randy.
Thank you. Everything's so scary and unsettled, and I knew that the budget was going to get shook up. and this is just really reassuring that it's being looked at studiously, carefully, kindly. And so I think that we should all feel that although things are unstable and unknown, we're pretty steady. And I take a lot of feels good. My words are gone tonight. Councillor Pryor, I really appreciate you pointing out that people come first. I think that the recovery financially and our already challenges of jobs and housing are really going to have to be front and center, because a city is about people. And we do need infrastructure. I'm not against infrastructure, but we're going to be so challenged with our funding. I want to make sure that not only are we looking forward as we do, taking care of our physical world, that we really put the people first. I have one more factual question. The money for public safety from the payroll, we had divided up where we thought different amounts would go to. So much for police, so much for the court, so much for youth. Are those parameters flexible within that payroll money, or does it have to go that much to police and fire and court? Nobody knows.
Yeah, I think it would be, I think there's a couple of people on this call that can answer that question. And so this format makes that a little bit challenging. So could that be one of those items that we just follow up with a memo on how we can be flexible with that?
Yeah, I'd like to know that. The firefighters have also asked, they didn't get a fair share. So I'm just wondering that since we're going to have, uneven experience that we don't know, it would be nice to know if that's flexible. Thank you. Good job.
Thank you. Randy, followed by Councilor Ye.
I want to start by thanking the mayor and council for the opportunity to sit on this side of the table. I'm really looking forward to this process. Sarah, executive team, and budget staff, one more time, you've provided an excellent document to work from. I've got to say, I did have some prepared comments based on the original budget, but after I saw the amendment, you addressed a lot of the concerns I had about preparing for the valley that's going to be coming when we hit the full impact of the economic shock that is coming. I agree very much with some of the comments Councillor Pryor made regarding one-time money. I think this is one of those times where sometimes one-time money, when we look at it as a bridge, is going to help us continue to move forward with some of these important programs. And also looking ahead at how do we help our workforce out in the community and our businesses restart, and what's our role going to be in that. And that goes even beyond the budget, but the budget helps inform and determine what we are able to do. So I think that's something we need to be looking at as well. I don't really have any questions at this point. Staff has already been excellent in answering some of the questions I had over the last couple of weeks. And I have no motions at this point. I'll just say that ahead of time to save some time. I want to read the amended budget a little more closely. I just had a chance to kind of skim it before the meeting. So I want to give that some more thought and reserve that right downstream. But with that said, I'm planning to approach as a budget committee member with hopefully an economy of words, try to make what I do meaningful. And this is a difficult process under this format. I think it'll work, and I think it'll help us find new ways to operate in the future, and hopefully ways that we can rethink our lives. But at the same time, I think we need to move through this as expeditiously as possible, and I think we have a really good starting point. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Ye, followed by Catherine.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. I'm very impressed with this presentation. I think, Sarah, you and your staff are doing an excellent job. I think they have a really good grasp of what the council's priorities are, which is I'm very glad to see because the changes and the things in the budget really reflect the priorities that I have, and I think that other counselors have as well. I agree with what other folks have already said about putting people first, and I think that's reflected in the presentation, and I am fully in support of that. And I also agree with your perspective on one-time money and how we might utilize that. So that's all very encouraging. I can understand how you're uncomfortable with having a lower reserve. It makes me nervous too, but I think at the same time, I think it's appropriate and manageable. So I like that strategy as well. And I don't have any questions at this time.
Thanks.
Thank you. Catherine, followed by Sean.
Hi, I want to echo everyone else's comments so far about just the great work that you guys have been doing and the incredible work to kind of turn around an amended proposal and just figuring out what that looks like is pretty incredible. I really appreciated also the focus in the initial proposed budget of kind of moving those what have been one-time funds over to ongoing and really recognizing the difference between those. So I want to really support the intention behind that, even if maybe this year isn't necessarily, or the next couple of years when we do that. I think that's really great, both in terms of looking what our actual expenses should be moving forward and acknowledging the importance of those issues and that they are these bigger picture things that are not just going to be these one-off projects. So thank you for that. I also really like the idea of that you're sort of building in these opportunities to adjust along the way over the next several years, so that we're not sort of going in and just slashing everything down under these assumptions that everything's going to be bad and terrible, but giving space to make those adjustments if needed. And I had a couple questions. One was for the community safety funding and services. My understanding is that there's going to be sort of a shift in the ramp up given the change in the bridge funding, and that is lower than what it had been. And so was wondering if sort of how the decisions are being made about what that's going to, like what that looks like in terms of which services get rolled out slower compared to others. And then also if you all have any are able at all, and I understand if the answer is no, to kind of plan for once the revenue from the actual payroll tax kicks in, what we think that's going to look like differently from what we had initially planned for the first 6 months of the current fiscal year. That was kind of a lot of questions, but.
So let me tackle the front end of that when we talk about the ramp up, and maybe then I'll let Twyla weigh in on kind of what some of the community safety initiative or payroll tax revenue forecasts might look like. That might be a little bit different than what we originally had forecasted for. So essentially what's happened in the last several months, and most specifically in a supplemental budget of this last year, is we were in a really good, strong position of feeling good about our collection period that was going to happen January of 2021. And so the idea was we were going to borrow against those future revenues to do what we called the Bridge Plus, which was occurring over this last 6 months. And of course, we fell right into the pandemic almost a month and a half after, 2 months after we started to implement that. So when we talked about the Bridge and the Bridge Plus, so those are two separate kind of buckets and two separate initiatives. What we've really done is we've fallen back to just the original Bridge strategy, which was proposed in supplemental budget in December of 2018, that carried us through all of the calendar year 2019 and 6 months into this calendar year that was going to be ending the end of this June. And the good news is that the majority of what we said that we were going to try and accomplish in the original Bridge, we were actually able to accomplish. I know for my staff, I'm fully staffed in the Bridge strategy, and we've actually got all those officers on the road. We've got most of those dispatchers sitting behind taking calls, and all of the CSOs were hired. So we're really going to shed kind of the Bridge Plus strategy, and some of that is going to be absorbed back into the Bridge and back into the general fund, and really just focus from now until we start collecting payroll tax, and probably potentially into early 2021 on just trying to live in that Bridge funding strategy, and then see what the collection looks like, see what the percentage of successful collection is going to be, and see what the available payrolls are going to look like for us to be able to collect from. Make sure we pay that loan back is our first priority. And then as that forecast is updated, it really will speak to how much we can start investing in community safety initiative, and then a really measured approach and balanced approach between all of the beneficiaries of the CSI, understanding that if we do something significant in one area, then it's going to impact the others. If I hire 20 more cops, then it's going to impact our municipal court and those types of things. So we'll be really measured about that approach.
Hi, this is Twyla. So on the revenue side, there is no clear answer for your question. But what we have looked at is our original modeling was based on a $7.9 billion payroll. We received some data from the Oregon Employment Department. And so what we've done is we've looked at what's happened with payroll during the Great Recession. So, you know, this is a different event. The employment levels will be different and affected in a different way than the Great Recession because that was caused by different factors. But what we did is we started there and then really kind of lowered the collection rate and took a very conservative approach because we didn't want to think we were going to collect more and then have another gap in the first year of collections. So we've took a very conservative approach, took that original revenue level, brought that down, and really reduced the collection rate down to maybe 50%. To get that $4.7 million number for the first 6 months of collection. So we will know more. It's really hard to say. A lot will depend on what happens over the summer. You know, as we kind of phase back into new normal, what does the business community look like? What's happening with employers and in employment in the city? So that's probably not very satisfying answer, but that's where we're at the moment. And of course, as we roll things in, we'll be monitoring and adjusting as we go.
And are those, thank you, those changes and assumptions reflected in the kind of forecasting information that's in the amended proposed budget documents?
Yes, on page 15, there's a page for the Community Safety Initiative, and you'll see the difference in the revenues and the loan amount. And yes, so that's all right there for you. And if you have further questions, we're always happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you. And then my one other quick thing was that I would appreciate, either it can come just to me or if others are interested, to the TAC report and TAC implementation, if it would be possible to get a report out on kind of how much has been used so far and for what purposes of the money that has been allocated towards TAC implementation. I think that might be helpful in thinking about sort of like what are next steps. And I think also especially given the what the state budget is likely to look like for the next few years, I don't know that the state is going to, even though I think it is a big priority for folks there, I don't know that that is going to be a super reliable place for us to count on for money moving forward for things over the next few years. So that would be great. Thank you.
All right, Sean, next up, Ty.
Thanks. I too was very pleased with the overall budget, but especially the color-coded UNA. I was really excited to see that. My questions start there. So regarding the seismic upgrades, the UNA still shows a substantial backlog of projects that are unfunded. Are we planning any upgrades in this budget? And what outside funding have we explored for these retrofits?
I'm gonna put this in the pool of things that we come back to you on, unless Mia just knows that off the top of her head.
Well, I was just going to say that this is Mia Carriaga, Central Services. That's likely a combination. I think your question is pointing to a combination of both facilities and public works infrastructure. And so Matt and I will work together to provide a list to you.
Great. I can comment on that just briefly and say that as far as our bridge infrastructure, we actually have in the current CIP, I think it's a little over $5-ish million that is going to seismic retrofits for Ferry Street Bridge, the Chambers Connector, which is the bridge by Second Chambers by our fire facility, and seismic retrofit of the West 11th Bridge over Amazon Creek. So we have a prioritization of bridges that we're looking for seismic retrofit funding for, and those are the top 3. And those are all funded through federal funding. So we have the opportunity to look for federal funding on kind of a reoccurring basis.
Great, thanks. Yeah, if there's a follow-up with more detail on that, I'd appreciate it. Also on the UNA, on page 236, right-of-way cleanup, it looks like we're budgeting to partially fund this with about $130,000 in the original proposed budget, leaving, I believe, $280,000 on the UNA. I'd love to understand what we would get if we were able to find that additional $280,000 to fund that UNA fully.
So this is Matt again. We can provide more information in a memo, but at a high level, that's actually bringing on permanent FTE to focus on this work, whereas the $130,000 we have on this budget is really looking for temporary work and just trying to stretch our ability to do the work. The whole UNA ask is a permanent group of people that are really focusing on that and ongoing, instead of trying to retask folks from other maintenance operations to help cover it.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so jumping back to some of the TAC implementation strategies. So you touched on this in the presentation regarding the county acquiring the River Avenue location. In the proposed budget, you outlined how council had directed you to divvy up the $1.9 million that we had set aside, and $836,000 of that was earmarked to purchase and erect a structure as a low barrier emergency shelter. What do we do with that money now? Is that still going towards a separate structure, towards this county structure? What's the plan there?
I think that's a really great question, and one more we're going to want to talk more about. I think the initial intent was that we would do that sprung structure, and we actually toured one of those in Portland. It's a great model for providing that service, and we were looking at a site where we might be able to do that. So if all decisions are we keep the River Avenue as a navigation site, then I think there's a potential question about will that funding go towards purchasing our half of that? You know, you could reallocate it towards the purchase of the property. If Lane County is reimbursed for that property, it could potentially be used for other site improvements, and all of this would require a different motion by the council. And the other possibility is if all of those funds are covered, then it could potentially be one-time dollars to at least get us up and going. So I think there's a range of options for that. Right now, based on the motion, it's set aside and it's not being spent because it's set aside for that specific purpose.
And it would have to go back to council to change that? Okay. And then you also touched on the idea that there's been some collaboration, obviously probably a lot of collaboration between the county and the city to understand the implementation timeline and ongoing funding for operating costs for various TAC initiatives. I guess I wonder, you know, I feel like we were kind of in the same place a year ago in sort of saying, hey, once we have the plan, we can really start talking about funding. What's this going to look like over the next few months? How are we going to get to that plan and that understanding about what Eugene's participation is going to look like in, you know, a significant number of these initiatives that are going to be run by various other jurisdictions?
I think that should be you know, as we move past this budget process and we start to think about how we plan for next year, I mean, we're not going to wait until the end of the year to start thinking about how we adjust for the conditions we're in right now. Will be a discussion about, you know, is this a time you want to go in and take our existing funds and reallocate towards these, or do we want to look at potential other revenue sources or other partnerships? We're actively working on this, and I will say we're working really closely with the county. I spend a lot of time every week on the phone and on Zoom and in person before this. The partnership's amazing, and I know that, you know, they're hoping that we would be able to come up with additional funding, and I think we're going to have to get super creative about it.
Okay, thanks. And then it wasn't clear to me in the proposed budget what our proposed HSC funding level will look like. It talks about what our funding looked like in fiscal year 20, and then also 2 specific programs amounting to $260,000 that we're going to be funding through the HSC. I'd love to understand what our overall budgeted proposed budget is for HSC spending. And then lastly, the CARES Act will provide at least $840,000 in additional funding to Eugene's CDBG fund in fiscal 21, and maybe more. What's our current plan for this additional funding?
We don't have a plan for that yet. So what we have is we have a consolidated plan that council just recently adopted, that this funding is separate from that because it's very much COVID related, and we have not had a policy discussion with them yet about how they want to use that. It's one-time dollars for COVID response. It could potentially be used towards something like the navigation center if it's part of that COVID response. So that's something we're still working through. Good, you're asking really awesome questions.
Well, I'm done. I'm all done.
Can't be done now.
All right, thank you very much. Ty, and then followed by myself.
Thank you, everyone, really. Staff, first of all, the budget is the pre-COVID budget that we were presented with initially was really thoughtful. I really appreciated the efforts to move away from one-time funding and into ongoing funding for all our ongoing priorities. That's a great philosophy that bump in the road, but I think we can get there. I'm really glad that we're looking in that direction. And then the response with COVID obviously threw everything for just the most massive loop. And I'm really impressed with the amendment piece. It covered all my concerns that I had looking at the proposed budget and thinking about what would have to change. So it's just, I'm happy with how thoughtful everything is. And then also, finally, I just want to thank everyone on this committee and everyone who's supporting us for the flexibility in meeting online and adjusting to what we have to do. So I'm going to be digging into it more since we only saw the proposals today, and I imagine I'll have some detailed questions by this weekend. But right now, really, as dire as the situation looks, I feel really good about how we're handling it and how carefully. I like that we're not doing anything really rash right now, and that we're instead building a lot of flexibility into our options for later and keeping the whole toolbox open as we get a better sense over time of where we actually stand, because so much of it's so uncertain right now. So as much as I can, at least with the pieces that we can control, I can just say that I'm feeling really, really good right now. And before I sign off on this, I'll say, here's a baby.
All right, thank you. I'm going to recognize myself, and then following myself, the only person I have so far indicating interest to speak in the queue is Eliza. So thank you very much, Sarah and Twyla and all the others. You've done a tremendous job adapting to this unprecedented time, and I really appreciate the nimbleness with which you've managed to navigate this enormous budget and city and meet all of these wide-ranging needs of the community. As far as motions, I'm actually not intending to put forward any motions that regard to money. I think, I do feel that now is a good time to kind of keep our reserves as available as possible. I do intend to put forward one procedural motion. And I've been working with staff to try to figure out just how broad this motion can be. Specifically, I'm looking at the GEMT funds being deposited into the ambulance transport fund instead of the general fund. These funds are directly attributable to ambulance transports that were provided, and from which reimbursement was low due to Medicare and other reasons. And this is a kind of a make up the difference sort of source of revenue, which again is directly attributable to the specific transports which were provided in a particular time. So from a transparency standpoint, it just makes sense to me that those funds be deposited into the ambulance transport fund. This kind of prompted a larger question of what other funds were being deposited into or what other revenues were being deposited into funds that were not necessarily closely related to the source of expenditure. I think the budget gives us some really good gross numbers, but it has a hard time showing us the net revenue after expenditures. But that's a big can of worms, as it turns out, and so I've been trying to work with finance staff to figure out how best to approach that. But I do intend to put forward at least a motion regarding the GEMT funds into the ambulance transport fund. With my time being up, I will recognize Eliza.
Thank you. So I have a couple of more specific questions that I wanted to bring up. I think we all have like the page in the budget that we flip to first when we get it. And you can hear a little bit from our comments what page that is. Mine tends to be the limited duration funding not continuing in the next year. And first I want to give a little bit of, or a lot of credit actually. In past years, I've had a lot of trouble figuring out what was actually happening to the services and the programs that were being funded by that. And I had a much easier time figuring that out this year, so thank you. I did have a couple of follow-up questions with that. I know that last year we allocated through a budget committee motion an additional $445,000 in one-time funding to the Human Services Commission to fill out an expected shortfall in community development block grant funding. Has that gap been filled in some other manner since then, or by not continuing that funding, are we functionally reducing that budget?
Waiting to see if anybody else is unmuting. I actually don't know the answer to that question, so I think I'll need to talk to staff about that one.
Okay. I can just say what's happening on the budget team staff is we've collected all those questions and with all of these, and we'll get back to you with, I think that we're trying to get answers from staff, other staff about that and some of your other questions, Eliza. So you should be getting a memo in next week's packet with some of those pieces.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that that's one of those areas where when we're thinking about what needs to be part of our recovery, that's definitely a piece of it when we're talking about how do we help people. The second question I think follows up on something Ryan brought up. As part of the construction excise tax ordinance, there was an intent to transfer every year money from the general fund into the housing trust fund. I know that last year that was done via supplemental budget and marginal beginning working capital. Is it and it's not reflected in this year's budget. is it the intent to do that again through supplemental and marginal beginning working capital? And if so, do we expect to have enough marginal beginning working capital that isn't needed for other things?
The intent was that that would come to council as part of the supplemental budget each year to the extent that marginal beginning working capital is available. That's a good question. You know, with so many, so much uncertainty and so many things happening right now, after the audit, we'll have to see how much marginal beginning working capital comes forward to council in December. But that was the intent of the work that went before council, is that would come on SB every year.
Okay. I think that that's maybe an area we need to think about some, because I do feel like housing is a very important area. It's one of these high priority areas. And because of the way that contribution was structured, that seems like the one that has taken the biggest budget hit in an almost invisible way. You know, I think that if we had cut that much money from climate, from homelessness services, that would be really clear and we'd be able to discuss it a little bit more. But it seems like the way that this is structured, it makes it really hard to see the impact that this is having, particularly on housing and housing affordability. So, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Go for Ryan, and then I currently am not seeing anyone else in the queue.
Thank you. I just want to circle back really fast to something Sean pointed out, in that the CDBG funds are a really important tool for us to use, especially because we can leverage that in the community. We have a wealth of nonprofits that operate in our region, and being able to use those funds to place them in the community in areas that, in realms with organizations already doing things that need to be done, often at a fraction of the cost the city itself can accomplish. I think this is a really important thing to recognize. So my question is there any more information on the process we can get? Will this decision be made in do we need a work session pull amongst our city councilors? Will we be in supplemental budget? How does that happen?
That's a good question. I think I've been asking questions about this too, like how much and when are we going to get it and how are we going to know? So it would have to be recognized and then appropriated to do something. So yeah, it would take a discussion with the council about how they want to prioritize that. We can give you more information on that too.
Awesome. That's it for me then. Thank you.
Excellent. In the absence of any other questions or discussions, we'll wrap up our discussion portion of tonight. Not seeing anyone waving at me frantically. We'll move on to the approval of the minutes. In your packet, there were minutes from the February 29th meeting. Are there any recommended changes or comments from anybody?
Move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Having heard a motion and a second, if you'd all raise your virtual hands and leave them up, let staff count them. They will unclick them and just give that a moment here.
If you don't have a virtual hand, just raise your real hand.
Yeah, we'll just leave those raised just to expedite things. I see Councilor Taylor raise your hand, Councilor Zoinka. Is anyone opposed? Not seeing anyone opposed. I'm going to trust that the count is correct, that it passes unanimously. All right, so moving on to next steps. We only have 2 meetings left in our budget season this year. Next Wednesday, the 20th, and the following Wednesday, the 27th, there will be an opportunity for public testimony at both of those meetings. Please remind folks, if you have any questions, please email them to Vicki or the other people. Any interest in motions, any questions you have. The process for motions will be similar as to what it was last year. Let us know as early as you can, if you would please, your intent to make a motion so that we can have the appropriate discussions next week. We want to identify any funding sources or other issues and have finance staff help compile this list. We're hoping to have everyone have submitted their motions by Thursday the 21st, so we can begin compiling them and get them out to folks well in advance of our last meeting. We're not going to entertain any discussion or deliberation about the motions next week. That we will wait until the final meeting on the 27th, and this will give all the members a chance to hear all the information, receive responses, hear public comment before we can begin our final deliberations. I did send out a message on Monday regarding how I intend to order those, and we'll just kind of put those hopefully in order as they're received, and then we will group them together if there are motions on similar topics. With that, without any other questions or concerns, I adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.